The allure of CD technology brought many new challengers to the home console market in the early to mid-90s. CDI, 3DO, but only one had what it took to cement itself as a new force in gaming. To simply say that the PlayStation's success changed the gaming landscape would be an understatement. Sony's unexpected dominance reshuffled the major players, pushed cinematic presentation, and introduced RPGs to a generation. With so many people owning so many PlayStation games, the PlayStation 2 would support discs from the original PlayStation, and later, so would the PS3. It's pretty remarkable just how many systems do support the original game discs, and download versions can even be played on the go. So the question of getting the best experience with PS1 games is not just, how do I get the best picture out of my system, but which system? Welcome to RGB206.
Sony released the PlayStation in Japan in December 1994, and worldwide in 1995. PlayStation was originally the name of an unreleased CD add-on for the SNES, so the console is ultimately the result of a soured relationship between Nintendo and Sony. When put up against its most comparable competitor, the 32-bit Sega Saturn is said to handle 2D graphics almost effortlessly, while the PlayStation is generally considered to be better with polygons. The PlayStation's 3D graphics are known for having a somewhat jumpy look, warping textures and twitchy polygons. This is due to the PlayStation building its worlds with integer-based arithmetic, which means that not all possible positions of a point can be approximated. The vast majority of PlayStation games output at a 240p resolution, which works great with CRTs and upscaler boxes. A very small handful of games do run at 480i, which is kind of surreal to see in action on a mid-90s console. A few others, while running at 240p for gameplay, may output the occasional 480i signal, often only on the title screen, as is the case with Wild Arms, or for in-game menus. Unfortunately, these few games can wreak havoc with video scalers, causing a sync drop during the transition between resolutions, rendering games with 480i menus like Silent Hill and Chrono Cross nearly unplayable. Some HD TVs may also struggle with this transition, while CRTs handle it seamlessly. Again, the vast majority of PS1 games output a constant 240p signal, so don't get too discouraged. But for games like Chrono Cross, we'll take a look at a workaround a bit later. The PlayStation features an AV out port, with a design that Sony continued to use up until the PS4 when it dropped the analog output. On the original PlayStation, the AV out port can provide composite, S-Video, and RGB. That's right, native support for RGB on all models, worldwide. RGB doesn't work with North American TVs, but we can use it with professional video monitors and upscalers like the Framemeister. It's worth noting that the PlayStation cannot provide a CSYNC signal for RGB. When shopping for RGB cables, you'll want to look for Sync on Luma, which is really just as good as CSYNC. Sync on Composite also works, but is more prone to video noise without proper shielding. We understand that PAL region systems perform poorly with Sync on Composite, though some RGB devices may require it. Component cables are not natively supported. The PlayStation's RGB output is really good. Sharp and clean, it stands well against RGB on any other console. Though it may be fair to say that RGB and higher fidelity displays don't do any favors for the highly compressed full-motion video that the system is famous for. Dithering can also show up really strongly in a few games like Metal Gear Solid. But overall, we really enjoy the clarity afforded to most of the system's graphics. In addition to the AV out, the oldest PlayStation units also have standard RCA jacks for composite video and stereo sound. Surely a convenient feature for a lot of people back in '95, but needless to say, we aren't really interested in playing with composite video today. But it's often said that the RCA jack provides superior composite video. We found that the quality between the RCA jack and multi-out was indistinguishable. In fact, compared to another console, it's a bit softer, which is arguably better, but it's not great. It is worth noting that these consoles do have slightly crisper audio. There's one other cool advantage to the RCA Jack consoles, and we'll get into that a bit later. In 2000, Sony released the PS1, that's PSone, a much smaller version of the original console. Some say that it features the sharpest video output of any PlayStation. Going head-to-head with an older PlayStation console, we do see that the PS1 has a minor advantage. But when we compare the PS1 against another PlayStation, the quality appears to be identical. In truth, Sony simply started using better video encoders at some point, and it's not specific to the smaller consoles. Because the PlayStation has an insane number of board revisions, no one to our knowledge has done the research to really determine which consoles might have this. But it's certainly no SNES situation, where the older consoles really are noticeably blurry. We think you'd be happy with RGB from any PlayStation console.
Alright, let's talk about the PS2, or rather PS1 games on the PS2. The PS2 outputs PS1 games at the original resolution they were designed for, meaning the system will output the correct resolution of 240p or 480i with no unwanted scaling or processing. The AV out on the PS2 appears to be identical to the one on the original system and supports all of the same cables, but on the inside it's wired up for one important addition. The PS2 is the first game console to support YPB-PR component video. For us in North America, it was the first time we were able to get anything close to RGB on our TV sets, allowing a boost to PS1 image quality using a simple connector that the original PlayStation hardware can't use. But let's not forget that the PS2 can do RGB, just like the original PlayStation. Again, we recommend sync on Luma cables because the PS2 also cannot output a pure sync signal. So does the PS2 make PS1 games look any better? Well, the colors show up slightly differently, but it's not really in a way where I think you could say one looks better than the other, or that you would even notice if they weren't side by side. PS2 appears to be just as sharp as the sharpest PS1 units. Component video generally compares very well alongside true RGB, and appears to be equally sharp. However, it does lose a small amount of contrast, and the quality of the PS2's internal YPB-PR encoding is not considered to be the best, meaning there's a bit of visual noise, most easily spotted in large areas of solid color. It's believed that the earliest PS2 consoles have the best component output. If the noise bothers you, go for RGB. If not, either is a fine choice. If you're using RGB or component video, you have to specifically choose the color space in the PS2 menu. That's RGB or YPB-PR if you're using component cables. Choosing the wrong one will either screw up the colors in a very distinct fashion, or you may not be able to see anything at all. If you need to navigate the menu blind, make sure no disk is in the system, wait a few moments after turning the console on, then hit down, X, wait 2 seconds, down, 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 X, right, X. But it's not all about image quality. Generally speaking, the PS2 is a good option for playing PS1 games. The CPU from the original PlayStation is on board inside the PS2, but the video circuitry is simulated by the PS2's graphics hardware. This can result in minor rendering differences, and a few games do exhibit glitches that tend to be fairly benign. Unfortunately, we haven't found any lists of documented issues that appear to be as reliable or comprehensive as we'd like. But most games do seem to run in a manner more or less indistinguishable from original hardware. The PS2 also has 2 options for altering how PS1 games run. Hit triangle twice on the PS2 system menu to access them. I feel like the texture filtering effect gets too far away from the original intent, but maybe it's something you'd like. There's also the option to run PS1 discs at a higher speed for faster loading, but this can cause issues with certain games. Oh, and let's not forget the little old PS2 Slim, which turns in pretty much the exact same results. Overall, we feel that playing PS1 games on the PS2 is a solid option.
When Sony first launched the PS3 in 2006, every system featured PS2 hardware on board to support backwards compatibility with PS2 discs. To cut costs, this was later changed to emulation-based backwards compatibility, and by the end of 2008, this feature was cut from new consoles altogether. It's a common misconception that this measure also removed backwards compatibility with PS1 discs, and that is completely untrue. From the beginning, every model of PS3 has had the ability to play PS1 discs, as well as PS1 Classics downloaded from the PlayStation Store. Discs and downloads both run via emulation on all PS3 models. Now this comes with the obvious benefit of digital HDMI output at a 1080p resolution with no need for an upscaler box like the Framemeister. For a long time, I thought it just couldn't get any better than this. But in truth, you can actually get sharper results with analog RGB from the PS1 or PS2 with a good upscaler. There's also a smoothing option, which just applies extra blur to the entire screen, rather than only smoothing textures like the PS2 does. Now here's a weird, cool thing. Certain disc games will render sharper than downloads, even compared to download versions of the same game. In fact, it's sharper than original hardware through the Framemeister. However, scaling is uneven, meaning that pixel shape is inconsistent across the screen, which can cause shimmering issues with screen scrolling. Scaling is more uniform at 720p, but not perfect. Still, it's pretty interesting, and this phenomenon does apply to a large number of game discs that we've tested, but not all. We've been unable to find any additional information, and are uncertain what triggers a sharper or softer render. If you're a bit of a CRT junkie, like I've kind of become, the PS3 unfortunately cannot output 240p at all, not even with analog connections. If you set the PS3 to output 480i to a CRT, you're going to be getting interlaced flicker in 240p games that shouldn't be there at all. So even if it's imperfect, your best bet when it comes to playing PS1 games on the PS3 is to just let it do its own thing and internally scale to 1080p for your HD TV. Now, remember when I mentioned that there was another good way to avoid sync issues with games like Chrono Cross that frequently switch between 240p and 480i during gameplay? Well, if you can't use the original hardware on a CRT, then the PS3 is definitely the way to go for playing games like these on an HD TV. It may lack the crispness of something like the Framemeister, but it's certainly not a bad alternative. If you're sensitive to input lag, be warned that there is some lag inherent to PS3's PS1 emulation. Maybe it sounds like we're being kinda hard on the PS3's backwards compatibility, and we don't mean for it to come across that way at all. For the vast majority of PlayStation fans, the PS3 is in fact probably the smartest option. They're readily available. You don't have to worry about whether your PS1 or PS2 still works. You don't have to have space for a CRT or shell out money for a Framemeister. And you know, it certainly beats plugging in a PS1 or PS2 directly into your HD TV. Of course, some games do have issues, as you might expect, but it's a solid PS1 playing machine for the vast majority of games. PS3 may not be the best, but it's absolutely the most convenient.
Sony's portable machines obviously don't support the original PS1 discs, but they do offer some surprising possibilities for playing PS1 Classics downloads. And not just for the convenience and novelty of playing them on a handheld device. Believe it or not, you may want to consider them for playing your downloaded PS1 games on your HD TV or CRT, even over the PS3. The PSP features a 480 by 272 pixel LCD display, which means 240p will fit easily within the screen. Setting the scaling size for original keeps the image looking its sharpest. The PlayStation Vita has a resolution of 960 by 544, basically half of 1080p, But what's interesting is that the Vita's resolution is exactly double the PSP's, which means that downloadable PSP games, including PS1 Classics, fit the Vita's screen with a perfect 2x scale, resulting in a truly stunning image. Since Sony designed the Vita to fit PSP and PS1 games so perfectly, like wow, seriously, just look at that! It's a bit surprising that the Vita's microconsole counterpart, the PlayStation TV, is rather lacking in its scaling prowess, and only supports 480p, 720p, and 1080i. Unfortunately, Sony just didn't do anything impressive at all with PS1 scaling on the PS TV. What should have been a low-power, low-cost alternative to the PS3 is just a bit too blurry for our tastes. But let's go back to the PSP. This is where things start to get interesting. Starting with the first major redesign, the slimmer PSP-2000, Sony added support for video output. But unfortunately, PSP games appear very small on the screen and only play in a progressive resolution over component cables. The system does have an option for an interlaced mode, but PSP games can't use it. Now, if you watched our episode about gaming on CRTs and PVMs, you'll know that 240p is less like a proper standard and more like a clever video trick that just so happens to work with a 480i display. So if you set your PSP's output resolution to interlace, wanna guess what happens when you launch a PS1 Classic? Amazingly enough, it outputs real deal 240p and displays the game at the correct size, just like on original hardware. This makes PSP the only way to play downloadable PS1 Classics from the PlayStation Store in their intended resolution, which, needless to say, is fantastic for CRTs or for processing through an external scaler. One downside is that while the PS3's internal scaling eliminates issues surrounding 240p and 480i switches, the Framemeister has trouble with the PSP just like any other console with 240p and 480i. But what's bizarre is that even CRTs don't handle the PSP's resolution switch seamlessly like they do with the PS1 or PS2. If you set your PSP to progressive mode, the 480p output will be scaled in a bit of a blurry fashion. 240p works only when the system is set to interlaced. The PSP-3000 adds interlace support for PSP games and works just as well for PS1 games. It gets better though. Remember how stupid you thought the PSP GO was when Sony announced a premium price device that could only play download games? Well, the PSP GO gets the last laugh here. Not only does it output PS1 games just as well as the PSP 2000 or 3000, but it's the only PSP that can sync up with a DualShock 3, giving the advantage of comfort and a full set of shoulder buttons, making the PSP GO the ultimate PS1 Classics microconsole. Just note that the PSP GO uses a different set of component cables from the PSP 2000 and PSP 3000. Thanks to the output being unscaled 240p, there's so much potential to tweak and improve. All the same, don't expect image quality to blow you away. It's a bit soft, and sometimes there are weird dithering issues. But it does look great on a CRT. Even with the Framemeister, I haven't managed to get it to be as pristine as a PS1 or PS2, but I think I'm going to start using the PSP over the PS3 for these downloads. But remember, not every PS1 Classic that can be bought for the PS3 can be played on PSP, and the system is well past obsolete as far as Sony is concerned. Definitely double check availability and compatibility for your favorite games. Much as I prefer physical copies, I honestly can't say no to having the option to download The Misadventures of Tron Bonne and play it in glorious 240p without paying well over $200 on eBay. I'd say that playing PS1 games on the PSP is well worth a look.
Alright, let's take a look at just a few more considerations. Remember how I said there's a cool advantage to the RCA Jack units? Namco's GunCon for the PlayStation is maybe the coolest light gun ever made, but it works just a bit differently than your traditional zapper or light phaser. Just like those, it only works on a CRT, but it also requires a sync signal, which it pulls from your console's composite video. Unfortunately, this kind of locks you into playing light gun games in composite only, but there are workarounds. The simplest is if you have a RCA Jack unit. Simply plug S-Video or RGB into the multi-out and pull composite video from the RCA Jack, and enjoy some high-quality light gun action. Alternately, you could try to track down one of these AV pass-through dongles that I have. Or if you're playing on a PS2, you can use SCINC from the green component plug. There are also generic cables that include both composite and S-Video. Retro Console Accessories on eBay also offers a knee RGB cable that includes light gun support. Remember that these light guns only work on CRT televisions or professional video monitors. Speaking of cables, there's a bit of weirdness regarding how PS1 and PS2 RGB cables are designed. In fact, they're not supposed to be built the exact same way by Sony's specifications, despite cable makers generally selling them as universal PS1 and PS2 cables. But in reality, you're unlikely to run into any perceptible issues. A well-designed cable for PS1 should work just as well for PS2, and vice versa. And lastly, let's talk a little bit about PlayStation emulation on PC. While emulators are not illegal in and of themselves, there are cloudy issues surrounding the use of the PlayStation system BIOS. But it is pretty neat that you can use legit game discs with a PC emulator. Though performance may be imperfect, you've got to admit that it's fascinating to see high-resolution 3D graphics from games this old.
Three consoles, 2 portables, 1 micro console, and a ton of revisions of each, all supporting the incredible legacy of the original PlayStation. It's such a shame that for now this tradition appears to have ended with the PS4. But no matter what Sony may do in the future, we've got no shortage of options for enjoying the classics today.